Hey, what's going on? This is Jay Farrell. You listening to the Hard NOC Life podcast. What up, though?
Well, it's the NOC in full color. You see me? The Hard NOC Life. Comics, movies, and TV. Yeah. Pop culture with a
Your ears are not playing tricks on you. This is the Hard NOC Life podcast feed, but this is not Hard NOC Life. Giving you a bonus special episode of DC Multicast. That's the other podcast I've been preoccupying my time with over the last 10 weeks. We just wrapped up our final episode of our second season, talking about Watchmen, the 2009 film directed by Zack Snyder. My Hard NOC Live co-host Dominic Mah was the special guest, so I figured why not put it on the Hard NOC feed, give you guys a preview. Last time we previewed DC Multicast, it was the first episode kicking off the season. Julian Lytle talking about Batman Returns. Did 8 films in between and wrapped up with Watchmen with Dominic. So listen to the Watchmen episode here on the Hard NOC feed. If you like what you're hearing, go subscribe to DC Multicast. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio. Best place is to go to hardknockmedia.com and subscribe from there. You'll have all the episodes from this season, plus the episodes from last season, which we talked about films all the way back to 1950s through the 89 Batman. This season, we talked about Batman Returns, the Christopher Nolan films. It was really fun episodes, really fun conversations. I got to speak to comic book creators like Jamal Igle and Joe Illidge. A lot of episodes this season. It was the 30th anniversary of Batman Forever. Got to talk to Dr. Drea Litamendi about the psychology of that film. We spoke with Jet Raimi, the founder of Batman on Film, for the 20th anniversary of Batman Begins. A lot of cool movies, a lot of cool conversations. So head on over to hardknockmedia.com, subscribe to DC Multicast. But in celebration, here is the final episode, Season 2, Watchmen. Welcome to DC Multicast. I'm Keith Chow. You have reached the end of Season 2. Congratulations. Everyone who's been on this journey from the beginning, I thank you for listening. This is the final episode of Season 2. If you guys want us to come back, maybe we'll come back for Season 3 where we can talk about more films in the DC canon. But we are ending Season 2 with a little film that came out in March of 2009. It's Zack Snyder's Watchmen. And I've brought on my co-host of Hard NOC Life. He's spoken to Zack Snyder.
I have spoken to Zack Snyder. Yeah.
He's my resident Watchmen expert. Please welcome Dominic Mah.
Hi, Keith. Good to see you.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a while. I'm Dominic, and I did interview Zack Snyder once, and for like 5 minutes. And I just want to say as a general note, like, as far as talking about Watchmen 2009, and I want to start with talking about, Zack Snyder's just a fellow who directed this movie. Not so much of the phenomenon. The phenomenon is a big deal, but maybe we can get into a little bit later.
Yeah. This film predates the Snyderverse. He was not the cult figure that he ended up becoming when this movie came out. He was still a up and coming, alter
Right.
in the Hollywood space.
Yeah. He had done pretty much like 300 and Sucker Punch, and I think, and
Michael Jordan's Playground.
And Michael, right? Cannot forget Michael Jordan's Playground. But yeah, and Watchmen is a very, very interesting arc across its various incarnations in live action. But it will say that the first live action version is this 2009 film by Zack Snyder. So where do you want to start?
Well, I want to start there. The fact that, say what you will about Zack Snyder. He had done Dawn of the Dead too. Let's not forget that. That's actually one of his better films.
Totally.
You got to give him credit because he was able to film the quote unquote unfilmable Watchmen. There's a reason this movie sat in production hell for 20 years before it came out in 2009. It was originally optioned, I think, as soon as the book came out, because Joel Silver,
which I think is 1986.
Exactly.
Okay.
Joel Silver optioned the book the same year it came out. Joel Silver of Matrix fame.
The perfect guy to Watchmen. Yeah. Anyway.
And he had actually tried to get Alan Moore to write the screenplay, and Alan Moore was like, "Fuck you! I'm Alan Moore. I don't write screenplays of anything. Nothing I write is ever going to be adapted with my say so." So
yeah, Alan Moore has famously, conspicuously taken his name off any adaptation of his stuff into movie form.
And I think one of the reasons Watchmen had been considered unfilmable, and one of the reasons Alan Moore was like, I don't think anyone should make a movie out of this book, is that the book itself is very much a comic book that's a commentary on comic books.
For sure.
Like the way it's drawn, the way it's the way the story plays out, the infamous 9-panel layouts of every page.
Yeah.
Like it's a deconstruction of superhero storytelling in the comic book format. That's why Watchmen is as important a text as it is. And to translate that to film is a difficult task, to say the least.
Yeah, absolutely. And okay, I'm just going to set the stage just a little bit, just in case someone out there doesn't know Watchmen the comic at all. Like, okay, so, Watchmen originally comes out in 1986 and is written by Alan Moore and art by Dave Gibbons. And it is rightfully considered one of the iconic pieces of comic book canon. That also happens to be a really great read, and it's very dark, and there's sexual violence and political upheaval and all kinds of grim shit. And it's super literary because Alan Moore writes the shit out of his stuff in a particularly novelistic way. So there's that aspect too. It's like, not only is it difficult to film, it's difficult to film in the way that a novel is difficult to film because there's these long, winding monologues.
And not to mention all the supplementary material within the book itself. Like there are cuts to the Tales of the Black Freighter excerpts, which is this comic book this kid is reading at a newsstand, which is thematically tied. It's not quite like narratively tied because it's about this pirate that goes crazy, but it's thematically tied to like Ozymandias and the kind of like the way people are. Sanities are falling apart.
Right. To this day, I haven't really read the Castaway part of the original comic ever. I've always skimmed it.
So you just skip. Well, but it also incorporates like you can read Rorschach's psych file. You can read like the original Night Owl's biography is interspersed throughout the text. You know what I mean? Like it is to your point. It's a very heavy read. As my memory of the book. They're actually excerpted within the book. It's not like a separate text you read. Like no, they're like as you're flipping through the pages, all of a sudden, boom, Tales of the Black Freighter.
Yeah, and also every issue has an appendix or an afterword, which Alan Moore loves to do, setting up all the supplementary stories and the subplots and doing what was now a cliche, but the world building is vast.
Yeah.
Okay, so so you brought up a lot of interesting points. One thing I'll say to start is an interesting thing about Zack Snyder's 2009 film is it does not suffer from being not faithful to the material. In many weird ways, it could arguably be trying to be too faithful to the material. And part of that, what's tied up in that, and I think this is what makes Watchmen an interesting case, aside from all the other films we're probably discussing in this series, is, people really didn't know what we were going to get. There's no reference point because, Batman movies, we've had other Batman movies up to that point. We've had several of them. We kind of know the form and we can compare them, in the Matrix with other Batman movies exist or what we think a Superman movie looks like. Watchmen is not that. It doesn't have the super popular character, and it is, as you say, deconstructing comic books itself. So it's a really it's a really weird thing to it just lacks that familiar reference point. So when you sit down in the movie theater and maybe you haven't read the original 12-issue series, you're not exactly even sure what you're hoping for. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I'm not asking you, like, where were you on March 6, 2009? Like, were you anticipating with bated breath at midnight?
Right. It was different from that. Yeah, it was mainly highly anticipated because it was an outlier in the comics history continuum because it was so well done and broke out of the comics bubble a little bit and is perennially still a bestseller in the graphics novel section, but more like as a literary work,
Hmm.
more for its novel qualities than just its pure superhero qualities. And there's interesting stuff too. Like even though he was trying to, sorry, we're talking about the comic more than the movie, but they
Right,
connect
right.
eventually. Like you mentioned, the 9-panel layout. Like Watchmen was revolutionary as a comic because it arguably started this decompressed storytelling thing, which became basically the norm in comics. Like
Right, right.
instead of every panel being like a vivid action dynamic thing, there are just these stark panels where one little thing is changing from each one, and you have to look at it like a puzzle and figure out what's going on. And this, of course, becomes the norm in comics and the what I like to call the Brian Michael Bendis era, when you're doing all decompressed storytelling, and that not coincidentally goes with why comic book movies became such a great thing, because such a big thing, because they look exactly like movie storyboards. So it's actually really important in the history of how comics morph into these ubiquitous summer blockbuster movies.
Well, and to that point, I think the Watchmen film was almost, it came out too early.
Mm,
Like it came out in 2009. One theme that has come up through the course of this podcast series has been how like all the films we had been discussing still predate the current moment we live in, where to your point, superhero films have become ubiquitous. Up until this point, superhero movies were still outliers.
sure.
Like The Dark Knight and Iron Man came out a year before, and they were the ones that kicked off the tide we're still, surfing right now. But before that, like the comic book movie was a once in a while kind of thing. Some were better than others, some were bigger hits than others, but they were not ubiquitous.
Yes, there were not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah.
And I think if you do Watchmen now, there are more things to deconstruct than
Oh,
what Zack Snyder had at his disposal 17 years ago.
totally.
Right? Because like I think we've kind of seen some people have like take attempts at trying to deconstruct the whole. There was that wasn't there like an HBO show recently where the whole premise of the show was like they're this blockbuster studio
Oh, yeah,
trying to
yeah, I
make a
think it's called
superhero
a franchise or something
the
like that.
franchise. You're right, right.
Yeah.
So I mean, I think there's more material that's ripe for
Yeah.
deconstruction that I don't think. I mean, this is kind of one of the Zack Snyder problems is that he's always deconstructing things before there's anything to deconstruct. Like you have to construct the thing before you deconstruct the thing. This is more of a Batman v Superman critique than a Watchmen critique. But
Yeah, yeah.
he's very obsessed with the deconstruction, and I'm like, you need to have something to deconstruct first. And I think Watchmen, was a little bit ahead of its time because you could do a film where you're, to your point, instead of like just adapting straight the comic book, you can do a deconstruction of the superhero film genre
Mm-hmm.
and make the commentary on that than just,
Right. And
faithful visual adaptation of the book.
right. And ironically, I think they do really advance that notion 10 years later when we get to the HBO series.
Yeah.
But okay, but we'll get
We'll save that. We'll save that for later.
deeper
Yeah,
into
yeah.
that later. But yeah, let's talk about the movie again. Watchmen, the actual movie. There are interesting timing issues, as you pointed out, the context of when it comes out. I think Watchmen live actions might have suffered from bad timing in a couple senses because it did come out 2009, and it's Dark Knight had just come out, and also the first Iron Man movie came out,
Right.
and also Barack Obama had just been elected for the first time. There was a feeling of hope. Sorry to be corny, but so this movie, which was the movie that, a very bleak and trying to possibly the darkest, most too realistic superhero story, which has been kicking around for years and years, comes out just 2009 when like, oh, whoa, hey, maybe Iron Man's a cool thing, like as opposed
Back when
to
people said Elon Musk and it was like positive.
yeah, exactly. So this incredibly dark dystopian society shit maybe just landed a few years later or a few years too early for when it really would have hit. And the end, again, just to just to bookend the points, and then the Watchmen TV series, which also was a great Trailblazer came out when? 2019, before the pandemic started. And then who cared about anything? Even though it was probably the finest moment in superhero adaptations, it hit exactly at the moment before we could give less of a shit about any of that shit.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry, back to the movie.
Well, no, I mean, there's something
Yeah.
to be said though about, we have the way these like pop culture holds a mirror up to the real world. Like when we have, like, to your point, a positive kind of less
Vibe.
cynical, let's just say, political world,
Yeah.
and like those first Obama years, maybe that's why pop culture reacts with more bleakness. But then when we have like, when was the West Wing popular? Well, it was popular during the Bush administration.
Yeah.
So it was like, oh, this is what the real life is like. Well, let's have this fantasy world where the president actually gets shit done. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, and I think maybe this is now another period where we're going to see more. I mean, actually, one thing that I was watching recently is Paradise, which is about this kind of like idealistic president and stuff. So it's kind of like you have the idealistic presidents in times of like dark real life presidencies, and then you have, like the corrupt presidency stories during more hopeful times. I don't know. I mean, not sure what kind of political stories we had during the Biden years, but it's definitely like it's hard rewatching Watchmen and seeing like Richard Nixon running for like a third and fourth term and thinking like, holy shit, that's actually
Yeah, there is that. And Richard Nixon's vain idiot president seems rather quaint in comparison. I would like right now, yeah, man, I wish they'd run someone like only as annoying as Richard Nixon.
If only we had Henry Kissinger making
Right.
foreign policy decisions nowadays.
Yeah, or Dick Cheney. Okay, never mind. Well,
Yeah.
we're gonna.
Well,
we're gonna get
another
into
thing
that.
though, like
Yeah.
the one of the big deals in the movie is that we were moving to 5 minutes to midnight, and it's like the front page of every newspaper
Yeah.
in the universe. And meanwhile, in the real world, we're like 89 seconds to midnight.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a little
No one
weird.
gives
Yeah.
a shit.
Yeah, but again, this is set back in the Cold War, and blah blah.
And now we're on the side of the Russians, so like things do change over time.
Yeah, it's goofy as shit. Okay, Watchmen the movie.
Well, I think one thing you said earlier is that Zack Snyder is pretty faithful in the way he adapts the comic book source material into live action. Before this he did 300, and then after this he does Batman versus Superman. And I'll modify that point because I don't disagree. I think he is faithful to the visuals of said comics. I think where Zack Snyder's often comes up short is adapting the thematic point of those stories, because he's so, I mean, he's a visual filmmaker. That's kind of his thing. And I'll always give him credit for like having beautiful looking images in his movies, or being able to recreate, to the T, like the panels of the comic. But I think where he often gets overwhelmed is by like the point that those stories are making, the point of those visuals. Like one example, and this we're going to jump a little bit in the script, but there's a fight scene between Silk Spectre, Night Owl, and like prison guards.
Yeah.
And it's like, they're breaking bones and it's like slow motion and looks badass. But the whole point of that fight scene in the comic is that Night Owl is not a badass. It's almost like, I mean, he gets pleasure. Like he has to, like the crime fighting is where he gets pleasure because he's got erectile dysfunction in the bedroom. But like, it's not glorified violence in the comics the way it is in the movie.
Yeah. No,
You know
that's
what I mean? Like
interesting.
there's a bit of like the way he lingers over how badass his fighters are. Or like even just giving Ozymandias and spoiler alert, Ozymandias is the one who kills the comedian in the beginning, but giving them like superpowers when they're like punching each other.
Yeah.
It kind of misses the point, I think, of who the crime busters were.
There's an alternate world where like it's more a scene about a pudgy, slightly over middle-aged guy just sort of reclaiming his,
Right.
hand-to-hand fighting prowess, and it's kind of, and he gets through it because, old veteran. And actually that comes up again in the extended version. But anyway, but yes, you nailed the dichotomy of the thing, the visual versus the bigger themes. I'm going to start on the good part first. TLDR, Watchmen, the actual movie, I don't think is a great movie. But the opening credit sequence, wow.
Oh, set to Bob Dylan? Yeah.
Yes, set to the Bob Dylan song. Remembering the opening credit sequence. really does a lot, really shows off Zack Snyder doing some of his best stuff. Again, with with his special look, the high contrast, playing with saturations, and creating a look that arguably is like the most impressive comic book kind of look like that we've got. The just those images really snap, and there's no talking in that sequence. He's just creating tableaus, really detailed visual tableaus,
which is what he's good at.
right, showing the alternate history of the world in slow motion, which he also loves to do, and doing his damned best. And again, I don't know if anyone could have done a better job, because Watchmen is so much to encapsulate the alternate history of the world in like 2 minutes. And you need to know the alternate history of the world to even like
Right.
get a handle on this story, which is why it makes it, quote unquote, potentially unfilmable.
And not just that, but also like the evolution of the Minutemen into the Crime Busters. Although I guess they're not called the Crime Busters in this, they're just called the Watchmen.
Yeah.
That kind of history of who these vigilantes are and why they're like, there are these like superhero teams of crime fighters in this alternate world. I think, yeah, absolutely. I think it's a virtuoso performance of Zack Snyder. It's probably one of his calling cards for sure.
Yeah. And then the movie starts.
And the actual movie kicks in.
And it gets
you're
complicated,
yeah. Well, I mean, the Rorschach, it goes from there to Rorschach's monologue, which is lifted directly from the comic, right? Like,
Yeah, and there's where we get into the two faithful parts, and the thing that where it has a chance and doesn't quite make it as a movie in Watchmen, I think, is in the performances and the acting, which is subjective, but it's just like very difficult to pull off that kind of thing. Rorschach's monologues are, they're a diary ranting of of a half crazy person. They're a long time. It's a high degree of difficulty acting stunt to pull off, and I definitely think they do their best, but it falls short of building a human connection, which arguably is been a pattern we see in a bunch of movies in the verses to follow. Also, again, back to that in a second, but a side note for context, that I did over last week preparing for this watch the original cut of the movie, and we should mention that there was an extended cut that came out, like sort of like that.
Are you saying a Snyder cut?
Yes, there was. I believe he prefers that one. Yeah, it's not 7 hours long like the Super JLA cut, but it's Justice League cut. But it's longer, and I sort of watched that, but I watched it in the modern way. Like, I put it on, and kind of, like I was probably checking some basketball scores while I was watching it. So I didn't watch it.
Right.
Who watches The Watchmen? I sort of watched it. And then there was an animated version, which came out just recently. I don't know if you're familiar with that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that one is pretty much like a super faithful, just animated recreation of the long Snyder
This
version.
is different from the motion cut, right? Like there was a motion cut that came out around the same time of the movie, which was like there was this fad in the late aughts, early 2010s where like I think Marvel did them too, where they would take the art from the comic. And I guess it was like a pre-AI thing, but they would just make those still images move and then call it a motion comic and then put those out in the world. And I don't know who the audience for those things were, because like the motion comic for Watchmen was like 5 hours long. It was like the entire book.
Yeah, no, it's not that
like you could just read the book, dude.
You could. I think that's the audiobooks versus reading books dichotomy that is going on there. But yeah, no, in addition, they made another animated version under the DC,
like actually animated, right?
Yeah,
not just making the panels.
And as far as I can tell, again, I half watched it while watching basketball scores, and it's just a even slightly longer, even more faithful, just animated version of the comic with that, in some places it like frame for frame just recreates the Snyder scenes, which is fine.
Oh, I see what you mean, because they kind of, I mean, it's animated and it's following the book story more than the movie story, but it's kind of taking its cues from the movie.
Yeah,
it's like framing and stuff.
Yeah, all the framing and the compositions, it's shot like
because you can't recreate the 9-panel page
Yeah, you
animated or live
right,
action, right? Like
right.
that's the whole
Again,
point of the book.
except I mean, you could on, vertical like social media formats like TikTok, but that's another story. That again, ahead of its time. Wow. If that vertical frame thing came out now, wow. It would make
I just that just unlocked something I never thought about all these years. Is that what is reading Watchmen on Comixology like?
yeah, I bet it's awesome.
Because I mean, for those of you who don't know, like Comixology is kind of like the ebook version of reading comics. There's a way you can read it where you can just see the full page and read it like a normal book. But
Yeah.
there's also like I forget what it's called, but it goes, automatically from panel to panel. And I wonder again, because
Yeah.
to me, what I love about the book is the visual of it, to see the grids basically and how
Yeah.
the story is told in between the gutters and everything. That's the whole point of comic book stories, like sequential
Yeah.
storytelling. So I do there is something lost in translation when you remove the grid.
Right. Well, we should retry that again as yet another way to reconsume the original story Watchmen. But anyway, but I did want to get to, and the recent animated version has an interesting voice cast, including Troy Baker and Katie Sackhoff, and they do a very solid job. And I wanted to use that to sort of pivot back to talking about, well, the the cast and the acting and performances in Watchmen 2009 and how it does or doesn't achieve its effect. I mean, like, incredibly difficult text. And when I was watching it again, I was thinking of I want your opinion on this visual bit. I was thinking of stuff like Blade Runner, another movie where like the Tears in the Rain speech, another movie where people have to say these sort of flowery science fiction things about, attack ships off Andromeda and stuff. But like you're really there, like you're there in the moment. And unfortunately, in Watchmen, there's much more of the case of they do seem to just be saying lines that maybe they themselves aren't even sure what they're talking about. And again, contrast with the later HBO TV series, where the performances and the cast are just like incredibly detailed and like involved in whatever they're doing. Despite that, it's completely ridiculous and involves frozen squids flying from the sky.
Mm.
There's a commitment level, and that draws you in. So I don't know. I'm trying. We're not trying to like shit on any actors in the course of doing this,
Sure.
but I think like arguably like a character like Rorschach, who's supposed to be sort of the linchpin of the whole story. Okay, sort of related to what you were saying about the Night Owl thing. Like, I think they just told him to just be badass.
Right, 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 right.
Just do badass voice all the time, sort of like they overdo in The Dark Knight. But what you wish for was the poignancy of this very fucked up guy, this very short fucked up guy who's puts on the badass face and is
Literally.
yeah, but literally and is just broken inside, just like fighting hate for himself and his own life and all that stuff. And I think we ended up with a one note version of Rorschach, whereas, a little more exploration of that, it would take you into that comic book thing where it's like, wow, I'm reading about a very real and serious character. Someone like I must know. Yeah. Does that make
Yeah,
sense
no,
what I'm
I mean
saying?
I'm 100. I mean, I think again this is a greater Snyder critique than just Watchmen, but this is the seeds of those critiques are present here. Where like again he's a great cinematographer, and I'm not to diminish the role of a cinematographer, but he can compose brilliant visuals. But like, is he a great director of actors? I mean, there's some line readings in Justice League and Batman v Superman and Man of Steel where it's like, ooh,
Yeah.
could have given Gal Gadot 3 or 4 more takes before you went with that
Yeah.
one
You're
to
not
print.
even
You know what I
sure
mean?
if they were paying attention to the line where they were shooting it. Is basically like
Yeah.
we got the lighting we wanted and like let's do it right.
So I think there's a lot of that that's present here, and I mean, I think the actors for the most part are well cast. Like, Patrick Wilson when he's not. It's funny, and maybe this is intentional to your point. Like, I think he's brilliantly cast when he's not in the suit.
Yeah.
When he's just Dan and he looks a little pudgy, even though like Patrick Wilson's a handsome guy.
Right. So he was actually playing against type, kind of.
Yeah, they make him realistically pudgy looking when he's outside of his suit. When he puts on the suit, he does look like Batman, and it's a little,
Yeah.
um, it's
Yeah.
a little to me like not off-putting, but it's like it doesn't connect because again, he looks ridiculous in the comic when he's in the Night Owl costume
Yeah.
because he's supposed to look ridiculous. He's a 50-year-old guy who's trying to put on the suit to like you said reclaim some sort of loss of virality.
Yeah.
But I mean, again, it goes back to like the whole glorifying like the suit and putting it on. And I do think what's his name? Jeffrey Dean Morgan is well cast as comedian. He's
Mm-hmm.
properly a dick and an asshole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you want to punch him in the face. And I don't know if there's some residuals like he's Negan from Walking Dead. So you're like, he's a completely hateful person.
Yeah, I think he managed to, typecast his way into that part pretty well.
from
right?
this from the
From that,
comedian.
yeah.
It's weird that he's like the Thomas Wayne of the Snyderverse.
Right, totally. Yeah, no, he works. I will but say like another point is that I get stuck on is like Ozymandias. I don't buy the guy playing Ozymandias.
He's too young.
Very important character. You gotta believe he's the smartest guy in the world
No.
and a really good hand-to-hand fighter. And he just seems like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no. I mean, I love Jeremy Irons
Yeah.
as Ozymandias in the TV show.
That works
Perfect casting.
a lot better.
Yeah, especially as an older Ozymandias. I think Matthew Good as like it's funny. Again, if you made it now, you put someone like I could see who would I put it? I was gonna say Henry Cavill, but Henry Cavill doesn't have like the smarts.
That would be
He doesn't
weird,
come off
that
as
would,
like
that would be a weird
intelligent.
troll, but okay.
But like to me, he didn't come off powerful enough.
Yeah.
Intellectually, physically, he didn't have the gravitas. Matthew Good, great actor. He was too young at the time. I think he looks. It's kind of like the Kate Bosworth as Lois Lane problem in Superman Returns.
Okay.
She's not believable as the seasoned Pulitzer Prize winning reporter
Sure.
because she's like 21 when that movie came.
Right.
I think Matthew Good
You
suffers.
think of
the
her being
same
like a
thing.
cub reporter, so to speak.
Right.
Yeah.
Honestly, Billy Crudup probably would have been more believable as Ozymandias than as Dr. Manhattan.
Oh, yeah, because Billy Crudup is playing Dr. Manhattan. Yeah.
And there's
And-
something about his Dr. Manhattan that's not quite. I mean, he's monotone enough, I
Yeah.
guess, but I don't know. There's something that's missing in his. Again, he looks just like Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah, they got that totally right.
Again, if you just watch this movie with mute, you'd think, oh yeah, this is just like the comic book. But when he's delivering his monologues, there's something missed. There is no gravitas in Billy Crudup's voice.
Yeah.
I think Yahya Abdul-Mateen is a much more believable Dr. Manhattan.
Well, yeah, both
Then
through
Billy
the writing and the performances, they got a lot more out of that Dr. Manhattan sub story in the HBO series. Again, all it takes is 10 years and this few years of Trump in perspective and the advent of the whole Marvel Cinematic Universe, and then we can come back and redo some things. Again,
well, but that's the point though, right? Like, there wasn't enough material to pick apart.
Yeah.
Speaking of Ozymandias, the one thing I did appreciate in the costume design is that he's got like the Batman Forever nipples on his costume. He's wearing like the rubber, his suit is like the rubber bat. Because again, that was the only thing you had as a source material. Like, if the whole point of Watchmen as a story is to deconstruct how superheroes are presented in the comics, and your film should be doing that same, but in like movie form, then yeah, you poke holes in the movies that came before, right?
Right. Oh, okay. You're focusing on the nipples now. Okay.
So like, I do think his commentary is very much like, remember those silly rubber Batman and Robin costumes? My superhero is going to wear that.
Right.
I think that's a proper use of meta commentary on
Oh,
the
right.
superhero.
Okay. So that was like a subtle joke. I didn't think about it that way, but I think you're
Oh,
right.
yeah,
You're talking
yeah.
about the Schumacher era,
Yeah.
which you've also covered in this series.
I totally think that's intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
they're a little too exaggerated, the costumes. You're focusing on the nipples, but that's all right. Did Night Owl, Owl not also have nipples?
Night Owl did not have nipples on his. It was
Okay.
just Ozymandias had
He
nipples on his.
Definitely had a ridiculous hat, which evoked many Batman-ish costume choices. There was another thing I wanted to say about the extended cut, which, again, I half watched. Because, again, watching the theatrical cut, not really involved in the character stories as much as we want to be. There's some like emotional impact thing that's not happened. Although there's a lot of beautiful visual stuff and a lot of meta commentary on nipples going on. Um, One thing that's in the extended cut that is non-theatrical version, I'm pretty sure, is this scene in the comic where the old night owl gets
Hmm.
killed by a gang of hoodlums.
Top knots.
Top knots, yeah. You're aware of that
Yeah, yeah.
difference
The
aspect?
Hollis, what's his name?
Hollis Mason,
Hollis Mason gets beat.
right?
Yeah, he gets
Yeah.
killed in the extended cut.
And
So
you've
let
seen
just
and you've seen
there
that
are
extended?
three cuts. Let's just
Yeah.
make sure
Okay.
there are three cuts of this film. There's the cut that came out in the theaters, which is the shortest of the three. The director's cut, the extended cut, which is what you watched, which
Mhm.
has the Hollis death scene and everything, and then the ultimate cut, which we referenced earlier, where they intersperse the animated Black Freighter.
Right. The
And I
animated
think they
pirates
even
stuff.
interspersed some of the Hollis Mason documentary footage into
Yeah.
the ultimate cut.
Yeah, it's got all
Kind of
this stuff.
recreate the whole reading the supplementary materials on top of
Yeah.
the comic itself.
And you have watched the longer versions of any
I've
kind, or you
tried
haven't?
watching the ultimate. I full disclosure, I have never actually watched it. I own the ultimate cut on 4K. Never actually made it through. I
Okay.
have seen clips of because they released Black Freighter as a separate DVD, like when the movie came out. And
Right,
then
like-
that DVD had the animated Black Freighter story plus the Under the Hood doc. They filmed the Under the Hood. That I'll give them credit. That was kind of cool. They filmed Under the Hood as like a documentary because in the book
Yeah.
it's his like autobiography.
Yeah.
So they did like this kind of like, A&E History Channel type, the story of
Yeah.
Hollis Mason as like this kind of like 80s style made for TV documentary, which they released on DVD. Like this was all supplementary material to the original Blu-ray release.
Yeah, and that's cool. But I question, who is that animated Tales of Black Freighter for? I'm sorry. I know Watchmen fans, real Watchmen fans out there. I challenge anyone that their favorite part is the castaway pirate part. That's like the
Again,
most
it's like I think
fan service
the
thing.
Alan Moore's reasoning
Okay.
for including it is that it's thematic to like the way
Yes,
you always skip it.
is.
The main point of the Black Freighter is that this guy is paranoid and like this pirate ship killed all his men. So he builds a raft with the bodies of the men who died
Yeah.
to go home to save his family, but he's driven mad by like all the paranoia. So when he finally makes it home, he ends up killing his family, thinking that they're
Yeah.
the Black Freighter. And that's kind of like supposed to be, I guess, Ozymandias' paranoia and why he decides to destroy humanity to save humanity.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. Or the whole just analogy to just being a superhero lonely existence kind of thing. But yeah, it's an important
you
thing.
don't need
But
to read it.
thematically, but
Yeah.
it's a novelistic thing. In a comic book, I wish they'd spent like done it in 2 or 3 pages instead of the 20 pages, however much it is in the comic books. And you definitely, unless you're some hardcore completist nerd, don't need the whole animated version of that subplot, which is only like an allegorical like novel thing to support one character's other arc. So I'm just saying, congratulations to the nerd that bought
Who
bought that
for?
animated DVD, right? And, but I did want to say, like the scene where that is not in the theatrical, where the original Night Owl sadly dies.
Mm.
For me, it ended up being one of the most effective, sort of heartrending scenes in the movie. In the movie that where I'm searching for like something emotionally to grab
Some
me,
humanity, yeah.
and I understand why it wasn't in the cut because it's not this most important subplot, and it's depressing as shit. It's a bunch of thugs beating the hell out of old guy. But they do it in the extended cut, and also they recreate it in the most recent animated version. And while he's doing it, he flashes back to, when he was a young dude in a costume fighting young thugs before they finally overwhelm him.
Mhm.
And that kind of thing is actually super touching. It made me think a lot of, remember how Sean Connery's death scene in The Untouchables?
Mhm.
It had that kind of great, great tragic weight. And in a movie where we're mainly absorbing plot and we aren't absorbing these like character moments so much. But that was like, so I just want to say, like, things like that in the extended cut are effective. And there were moments when we could have been drawn in, and I wanted to be more drawn in by Rorschach on that level.
So I don't want to we've already mentioned the TV series. I do want to give, we don't do the DC TV show podcast. This is all about the movies, but I do want to give some space to the Lindelof show that came out a couple years ago, because though it's not a follow-up to this movie, because it does reference the actual squid and controversially,
Right.
the movie ignores the giant squid.
Right.
I do want to let you have some space to talk about the HBO show, because it was a thematic sequel to the books that I think understood Watchmen better than DC's own before Watchmen comic book series.
Right. Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. They came out with some sequels in the comic book series. Yeah, the Watchmen HBO series 2019 was, I mean, for me, it's astounding. It was awesome. And again, bad timing, 2019. Shortly thereafter, didn't care about any of this shit for
And I
about
don't
2
think
years.
Lindelof ever intended to do
Right.
more than one season. I do feel like he was like, I got one season of stories to tell, and that's
Oh
it.
yeah, there was some hassle about like, why is it not being continued for a second season? It doesn't need to be. Not
Yeah.
every season is like about whether there's going to be a second or third season. Certain shows are geared for that. This wasn't it. This is it ends on, I mean, it ended in a great way. Spoiler alert. Like, if they want to do a second season, it could be about,
Regina King's
how
character.
Regina King gains omnipotent powers. Or you could just leave it as a cliffhanger and think about what if that happened.
Right.
But for me, that Watchmen TV series offered a path forward for the comic book shows just at a time when we're beginning to get sick of how many of them there are. I thought it did like an astounding job of taking like the basic world and going in a totally different way. But when I say different, I just mean it's just like on a comic book if you just started a new story arc in the same world. And so you kind of both did and didn't need to know about Watchmen, which was cool. The acting is incredible. The storyline draws from all this shit that's recently happening, the race, politics, and general Trump years.
Well, the fact that it incorporates racial politics, because that's one thing that's missing. I mean, there are people of color, sprinkled throughout the comic, but
It made it central.
the Tulsa massacre is essential to the beginning of that series.
Yeah, and then it famously does this thing of it converts Rorschach or into a symbol that is followed by the white power army.
Right.
Like, which you could see that happening. And again, that's not like, as my shirt likes to point out, AOC aligned herself with Rorschach at some point. Rorschach
Right.
himself is just a flawed guy, probably racist, but he wasn't like gonna start the white nationalists took him as a symbol, which is something that would play out starkly in real life.
Misappropriation of comic book symbols happens all the time.
Yep.
Punisher being the symbol of cops, for example.
Yeah.
Which is a storyline in the current Daredevil season that like they confront full on that like the cops think Punisher represents them, and I'm pretty sure Frank Castle would not agree with that.
Yeah. So, but anyway, in the Watchmen HBO series, we'll get to that Daredevil thing later. Thank you for reminding me. The white
Watchmen
supremacist
series.
movement appropriates Rorschach in the universe of the show, and that's where Rorschach's arc ends up. Which is sick and sad and all too real.
But I also give them credit. Like one of the things that I think they did, which was masterful, is that there's a character in the Minutemen who you see actually in the movie that was the original vigilante. He's the one who inspired all of the others.
Right.
Hooded Justice.
Right.
And you never know anything. Even in the comic books, there's never like the way Snake Eyes' origin used to be, a mystery, or Wolverine's origin used to be a mystery. Hooded Justice's origin was a mystery. He was just a guy in a hood and a noose, and he beat up bad guys.
Yeah.
And they did a brilliant interpretation of his origin story in the TV show. And, like, I remember how I said there were no people of color in the Watchmen movie? Well, it turns out retroactively.
Yeah. Retconned, really great retcon.
The way that episode plays out is brilliant.
Yeah. I remember when that episode came out, and you were raving about it, as we were all kind of raving
We
about
probably
it.
did an episode about that.
Yeah, no, because it was a really significant one, really special. And again, path forward, not taking the bits of what's there in Alan Moore's story and just taking it to a new revelatory place. And all along, why being like incredibly like shitty and hard to watch, right? Like I
Yeah.
remember watching like something it was like, oh, we're watching the superhero show on HBO. Again, I was watching with people who are not Watchmen fans, but like watching gritty HBO shit. Very bad luck was like with someone who's like, yeah, I like watch most of those things. I don't really want to watch any more things about cop violence because I get enough of that in the news. I was like, yeah, okay, well, we'll watch this episode of Watchmen, which turned out to be one of the most horrible cop violence things
Right.
you've ever seen in a fictional TV show. Lynchings and all that shit, but incredibly powerful. Anyway, so that series is amazing. And whatever, it kind of reclaims the Silk Spectre thing. So like, not even arguably, she's sort of like a sexy ingenue trope in the original, and Gene Smart sort of like takes it to a new place. Like, what if that person grew up was an FBI agent? That'd be wild. All that stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely perfect example of how you can, to your point, take the spirit of something and run with it and still be like, because that was to your point about the controversies of, certain Watchmen fans who are like, well, this is not my Watchmen, but like, if anything captured the spirit of the original comic, it did so more than even this movie does, right? Like this movie
Yeah.
visually looks like the comic book.
Yeah.
I think they missed the point on so many levels,
Yeah.
right? Like Zack Snyder's understanding of the humanity of these people is he would rather go for the cool visual than like
Yeah.
understanding like the Silk Spectre, Silk Spectre 2. I keep harping on this. The Silk Spectre 2 Night Owl fight in the prison
Yes.
is not supposed to be cool. It's not supposed to be
not
badass.
it's not supposed to be the old boy like action sequence thing.
But he can't help himself.
Well, yeah, and also they needed one at that point because it's supposed to be, again, it's supposed to be a superhero movie. You could tell they were shoehorning in some like big set piece things to fit this form that hadn't been fully developed yet. Yeah, and and all that stuff is good. But again, it gets back to that essential thing of faithful versus just creative.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely the Watchmen TV series was not faithful and didn't get hung up on being faithful to the visuals and the story, but all the ideas, it like went and ran with them.
Yeah. And in that sense, it was faithful.
Yeah,
Right. Like
exactly.
that's my point.
That,
It's
on that
definitely
level,
it's
it-
faithful in spirit. And I think too often we get, and maybe because comics are a visual medium, movies are visual, we get caught up in the visual aspect. And sometimes like the perfect is when the visual and the story and the themes all come together.
Yeah.
Because the big debate we always have on the Hard NOC Life podcast is when it comes to the DCU versus the MCU, is the MCU got the stories right. Visually, it's not the most interesting.
Yeah, generally.
Like, generally, it does. There are sometimes it's nice, but they got the humanity of the characters and they got the stories for the most part. That's how they hook people. The Snyderverse, maybe the stories wasn't great. The characters were not the most relatable, but visually, yeah, you pause the Blu-ray, it's a beautiful picture that you can make as a wallpaper,
Yeah.
but that's all it is. It's wallpaper.
Yeah,
It's
there's
missing the
a,
core.
there are a lot of wallpapery compositions, and it's just really good wallpaper. Well, we gotta give it. Like, all this shit aside, get a little stoned and watch Watchmen or just Snyder Batman versus Superman. This shit is great.
Yeah, it looks great. Looks great. Does Superman act like that normally? Man,
Right.
probably not. But Henry Cavill looked great. I will give him that. I don't want to leave
Yeah.
without addressing the big controversy of the film was that we did allude to it. The ending of the comic book is that Ozymandias and Dr. Manhattan are conspiring to create this genetically created monster, this giant squid that takes out
Giant bird squid.
that takes out like all of Manhattan, basically, the psychic giant bird squid. And that's the thing that brings the humanity together. Like the Ozymandias' whole point is that we need something to bring humanity together because we're on the verge of World War III. So we need to band together to fight against this pandemic. I mean, this
Right.
that doesn't
yes.
happen. There is no such thing as a alien threat to bring together humanity. In
Yeah,
the
turns out.
movie, because I think Snyder was like, I can't make a giant squid look cool. They changed it. and that
Mhm.
it's Ozymandias frames Dr. Man. Oh, Dr. Man's kind of in on it, but frames Dr.
He's-
Manhattan as the thing that like psychically kills half of humanity.
I actually think that's great. That's the one part of the movie that I think totally works because they elided the whole thing with the giant bird squid, and it makes sense if you need like a final act beat in your big summer movie. Yeah, he did it. Dr. Manhattan is framed and he created a nuclear explosion, and we get to question what the value is of having a super uber powerful super person. I think that part is fine as far as being non-faithful. And again, yeah, too little, too late at that point. I wish, they made more like exciting choices like that. And then interestingly, yes, as I said, when you get to the TV series again, they go back to the squid thing, which may or may not make sense to any people, but even when they do the weird flashback, like you felt the impact of it, even though it was ridiculous that was a giant bird squid. Like you felt the on the ground feeling of like, wow, that was a catastrophic thing that happened. Yeah, so I'm
So you
in.
don't miss the squid.
Well, fucking as far as that movie was going, again, what do you want at that point? You've introduced like 80 world building things. Again, you just can't do it in a feature movie. You
Yeah.
needed to cut that moment shorter because you just can't build all those things within a feature movie. Again,
And I will give Snyder credit though, because I think there's a scene when you see like the computers that Ozymandias uses to create the big thing at the end,
Mhm.
and instead of like calling it a squid, the name of the device they're developing is called like the subatomic quantum infrared device,
Yeah,
codename Squid.
yeah, yeah. I
So
think that's right. Yeah,
a squid does destroy humanity at the end,
yeah.
so it is faith.
Sure. I'm sorry. Do you differ in opinion? Do you
No,
want
no,
them to take that?
I did not have as much. I was not as attached to the squid, but I know that when the movie came out, that's the big thing. Like all the fanboys were up in arms about.
Yeah.
You know,
Which proves again that they stayed to watch the whole movie.
those are probably the same fanboys who are like, Snyder cultists nowadays, right? Like it's just weird
Yeah.
how things come full circle.
Yeah, very likely. I did want to add a few more things about like the TV series in light of, how much time has passed, all the shit we've gone through. Like in the TV series, all the little jokes about the world are like things about like President Redford of being president for like 20 years or something. They're really delightful and funny and like, gives you a perspective on things, how things might have shaken out in this alternate universe. And of course, like as we started talking about earlier, in the Watchmen universe, they don't have presidential term limits for some reason. So ridiculous things happen, like Nixon was president for like 20 years, and then Redford was president for like 20 years. And all these things which are, I'm just gonna say, all too real.
What? An imperial presidency? What? That's not realistic.
Are hinted at in
A
this
series of constitutional
little,
crises? No way.
little show that came out in 2019 and continues to be one of the best and most thought-provoking superhero shows that have ever been done.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
I think if you were to like look back at all superhero TV shows, Watchmen is at very least top 5, if not top 3, if not top 1.
Yeah, actually. Right. Oh, do we remember the part in Watchmen Universe, Vietnam becomes the 51st state?
Yeah. What?
That was ridiculous, huh? That was just so science fiction and crazy. How would that ever happen?
Yeah,
Who would
we would
even
never
think
do
to
that.
do that? But we did because we won the war there in this alternate universe.
Well, yeah, and
with,
we need
with
to
the help of
the
a
Great War with Canada that's forthcoming is
right.
is where we're going next. Also, one other thing I wanted to ask you about being a Chinese American from the Bay Area. This film was written by Alex C. I don't know if you know him. You guys are contemporaries. Again, having to give credit because so many screenwriters tried to make this movie and they could not crack the nut. From Sam Hamm, who wrote Batman and Batman Returns,
Sam
to
Hamm.
David Hayter, who wrote the first X-Men movie. These are some of the biggest names in Hollywood who could not figure out how to write a Watchmen movie. And Alex C came in and was just like, why don't we just like write the comic book?
Hey,
And
there's no, yeah. Well, that's great. I'm not that familiar with his work, so
he
I don't
doesn't
think
have a
it's cool.
huge filmography, but again, he's Chinese American from the Bay Area. So I
Right
just thought you
on.
have some insight there
Okay.
because you're as a fellow Chinese American filmmaker from the Bay Area.
Yeah, who has
It's nice
thought
to see a
about
fellow.
adaptations of Watchmen all the time. Yeah. And yeah, he he did a job on it. I don't think we can even say a bad or a good job. He did
Yeah.
a job which was constricted.
Well, I don't know how much you know about like the previous versions. Like Sam Hamm's version couldn't figure out the ending, right, with the squid and everything. So I think his involved like time paradoxes and like assassination attempts. Like the closest is David Hayter, because David Hayter gets a screenplay credit on this movie. Again, he's the
Okay.
one who wrote the first X-Men movie. His was pretty much a direct adaptation, except they just moved it forward in time. Instead
Hmm.
of taking place in the 80s, it took place at modern times, I guess in that the late aughts. So like instead of Vietnam as the background, it's kind of did the Iron Man thing. It
Yeah.
swapped Afghanistan for Vietnam.
Oh, okay. Huh.
So everything would have played out the same, except instead of the looming war in Vietnam, it's the looming war in, or not the looming war, but they were just conquering Vietnam. They would have just conquered Afghanistan. That's the
Right.
biggest change that the David Hayter script had.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. But again, this might be a weird thing to say, but I don't find a flaw with the script in the Watchmen movie. It's entirely execution based.
Yeah,
It's editing and what the actors are doing and whether they're
right.
involved in what they're saying or not. The script, it's one of those scripts that could have been so powerful, or it could be kind of just recited.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because to your point, a lot of the dialogue is straight up Alan Moore.
Yeah.
And is like, how do you make Alan Moore dialogue sound good? Spoken versus
Yeah.
reading it.
Yeah.
Because the ravings of a madman reads differently than when you hear it
Absolutely.
being spoken by a crazy looking redhead.
Yeah. Depends who's doing it. Yeah. So yeah, and then we got the squids again in the TV series, and that did make me kind of happy. And again, they wrote the shit out of that series. They because they actually could not just be like, well, I'll fall back on Alan Moore's script. They had to be
Right.
like, well, let's take the pieces of what you started and play out all these other things, and they wrote like really extraordinary scenes. I mean, that that black and white one is just is just one example. Like
Yeah.
the scenes are extraordinarily written and performed. So that was what I thought was a path forward for superhero movies, and then a lot of world happened. But anyway, and now it's 7 years later or whatever the hell it
Yeah.
is, 5 years later.
and 17 years later since this movie.
Yeah.
I do think a revisiting of Watchmen. I don't think they will ever try to make another Watchmen movie. I think this will be the one and only attempt at a Watchmen, at least a live action Watchmen movie that adapts the actual text. Whether or not we get a second season of the Lindelof show, I don't know. I think he's been pretty firm at saying, this is the story I wanted to tell. I told
Yeah,
it.
sure.
And I don't know that Watchmen, honestly, is an IP that you need to keep revisiting.
Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. I wonder, I mean, if only for I mean, I'm sure it is still a perennial bestseller and part of the canon, and that would be the motivation, right? That's why they keep doing sort of sequels in the comics.
Yeah, well, and
But-
only in recent years, I think
Yeah.
around the time that the show came out, like the Watchmen book was never quote unquote canon with the DC universe. I mean, it's interesting that
Right.
we're doing the Watchmen. I had a kind of like a decree of like which DC Comics films would I cover, would I not cover. I decided we're only going to do live action films. But then there are movies like V for Vendetta,
Alan Moore.
A History of Violence, Road to Perdition. These were imprints of DC at the time. Like
Yeah.
V for Vendetta was Vertigo. If there was one argument, you could probably argue I could have done a podcast on V for Vendetta, but I
Yeah.
didn't because they're not DC Universe stories.
Yeah.
Like it was just I also had to draw the line somewhere.
You had to draw the line somewhere. I mean,
But Watchmen is interesting because Watchmen technically, until recently, was not a DC Universe
right.
story, right? It was this kind of like one-off thing. In fact, Alan Moore had when he started writing, I think they had the rights to the
The Charleston comics.
the Charleston
characters.
comics,
Yes,
right,
let's
right.
talk about that for a little bit.
Because the question, like instead of the Rorschach, it was basically the question. I think Night Owl was basically like Blue Beetle.
Yeah, Night Owl was Blue Beetle. Rorschach was Question. Again, Dr. Manhattan was Captain Atom. Yeah, so somewhere in the history, DC acquired the Charleston Comics characters, which were like another smaller
I think it's
comic book
actually pronounced
company.
Charlton Comics.
Charlton, yeah, I'm
Whatever.
probably saying it wrong, and maybe I'm thinking
Yeah.
of Charleston Chew. Anyway, a small band of lesser known comic characters and were folded into the DC universe. And one thing another happened. I don't know the history, but he started writing for his characters and then didn't. So he's like, well, I've got these. I'm just going to make analogs of all those
Right.
characters. So Rorschach the Question, Silk Spectre was Nightshade, I believe. Oh, the comedian was, of course, Peacemaker, who
Mhm.
does have a
Mm-hmm.
TV show now. And Blue Beetle, yeah, we made that one, but there's very little resemblance between Blue Beetle and Night Owl writ large. But it just begged the thing, like, if they were to explore Watchmen again in different format, I think it would be cool to do those
Just use the Charlton characters.
and try to get under those. I mean, again, I don't know how James Gunn how attached he is to his interpretation of Peacemaker. But yeah, I mean, like if we get into the Captain Atom thing, and I can't remember who Ozymandias is supposed to be. It's not coming to me, but stuff like that.
Yeah, well, but I think, and that's the thing that like for a long time, the Watchmen just stood outside the DC comics.
Yeah.
It was just like perennial bestseller. It was this literary work that like libraries and schools would recommend. And then along the line, like I don't know, with Jeff Johns' decision or someone at Jim Lee's decision, they actually started to fold in the Watchmen into the proper DC universe. Like there were crossovers with like Dr. Manhattan and Superman. In fact, I think the whole rebirth story was like Dr. Manhattan saying, "Oh, the new 52 sucks, and we're going to bring back the old versions, the classic versions of these characters," and that's how they explained rebirth. You know,
in the comics universe again. Yeah. Did you read the ones where I don't remember the order? There's Rebirth, definitely where Dr. Manhattan was the all-powerful thing behind the universe dying and coming back to life again. I can't remember whether it was before or after Doomsday Clock. Did you read Doomsday Clock?
Yeah, Doomsday Clock, I think, was the short story that kicked off like, oh, the Watchmen are actually part of the DCU.
Okay, yeah. Okay, maybe
I don't know how much I like that idea. I kind of like the fact that the Watchmen were not DC
no,
universe
it's a
characters.
weird idea, and it's a good question whether like Johns or Lee or just what the impulse was, except for the fact that Watchmen probably still sells a lot of original copies.
Oh yeah, like the whole notion,
year,
like we're gonna do before Watchmen or Doomsday Clock. Yeah,
myself, it was so audacious. I love the idea of Dr. Manhattan is the actual threat to the universe again because it entertained a question that as comics fans I always ask, which is like,
who would win?
Yes, well, like if there were really superheroes and they had Dr. Manhattan's powers, wouldn't he really be more powerful than all of the DC heroes? What would happen if he ever met Superman?
Yeah,
they did really explore that story. And why doesn't Dr. Manhattan just remake the universe so everything's nice instead of going around like trying to stop bank robbers, shit like that. And I kind of like.
Did you think it was effective? Like one of the best standout scenes in the. I know we're kind of going all over the place. If you're listening, I apologize. One of the
still on
standout
Watchmen,
aspects
basically.
of just like the movie or the book too.
Yeah,
is his whole like when the way Dr. Manhattan narrates like being in multiple places and multiple times. And that's one of the coolest parts of the book. Do you think they captured that in the film? Like when he's like retelling his origin and he's building the thing on Mars, like it just doesn't, to me, it just doesn't translate.
I mean, that's funny you bring that up because to me, like, I think that's the thing that's like candy for Zack Snyder as his aesthetic because like, yeah, I would love to zoom through a bunch of things and create a really pretty image and not like linger on any of them. You know what I mean? That's kind of his ballpark. So, as a screenwriter person or film critic person, I'm just like, yeah, that part could have been done differently or elided. But I understand why you wanted to do it. Like that part is okay. But what we're missing again is the internal thought process of what does it feel like for Dr. Manhattan, half human, losing his humanity, being in all those moments at once, and how that would like affect your freaking brain.
Yeah. If anything, Zack Snyder was really good at all the needle drops. You mentioned Bob Dylan earlier.
Yep.
There's the comedian fight that's to Unforgettable by Nat King Cole. I will say like the sex scene to Hallelujah, a little weird.
No, Nah, I couldn't do it. In the animated version, it's like a smooth jazz thing playing. It is actually a little bit funnier
Not
because
Leonard Cohen. They didn't.
it looks a little bit like it's a little bit like porno music, which is, of course, sort of the service that scene serves.
Yeah.
Yeah, that Hallelujah thing. No, like, what the hell are you saying?
Again, it's
Like,
more like the Zack
yay,
Snyder know what he's doing.
yay! Somebody gets to have hot sex in this universe. Let's play. And by the way, if there's any clear bias that we can see for 100% sure about Zack Snyder, it's that he likes Leonard Cohen songs because they use another one or two in the Justice League. They did it's in the credits of Watchmen again. The first we take Manhattan. He may just be like,
Just a big Leonard Cohen guy.
exercising his point of personal privilege to put Leonard Cohen songs with anything, which is okay.
He even reuses Hallelujah in Justice League, doesn't he?
I believe so. In at least one of the versions. It's hard to keep track with all the
There's
versions.
so many Snyder cuts. Anyway, that's a good precursor. If and when we get to season 3 of this podcast, this is the end of season 2. This is our big season finale. It kind of makes sense to end on Watchmen because this is the film that launches Zack Snyder into the DC universe.
Yeah.
It's because of this that Christopher Nolan taps him to direct Man of Steel, which ultimately led to the creation of the Snyderverse.
Yeah.
And if not for this movie, we probably would not have had the Snyderverse, or we would have a different version of the DC extended universe.
Yeah. And we might have had a Green Lantern movie, alternate universes. And
Right. We'll talk about this when we get to the Green Lantern movie.
Oh, sorry, the other Green Lantern movie.
No, but
Not
my
the one that
conspiracy
actually...
theory is that the Green Lantern movie that came out in 2011 was meant to be the DC universe's Iron Man. Like if you rewatch that movie, first of all, they mimic a lot of Iron Man beats in that movie, but I think their intention was to say this is the first movie in an extended universe.
No, that's an excellent point. I think you're right. They just got sidetracked in different ways. And
it got sidetracked because it bombed. Yeah. It's like if Iron Man did not succeed, if Iron Man did not make money in 2008,
right,
we would have had multiple versions of the MCU the way we had multiple versions of the DC.
What year was Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern?
2011.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Timing. It's all in the timing.
It's all in the timing.
And the amount of Ryan Reynolds that you can stand. But that's a whole other story.
Well, kind of count your lucky stars. You didn't have a DC universe built on the back of Ryan Reynolds.
Oh my God. He's in the alternate universe. He's the one. He's in every movie. Recruiting the Justice League. Okay. But that didn't happen, for better or for worse.
That did not happen. We did get the Snyderverse. So when we come back for season 3, we're going to talk about Green Lantern. We're going to talk about Jonah Hex. That's weird. It's a weird kickoff to season 3 because Jonah Hex is the first DC movie. But then we get into Dark Knight Rises and ultimately Man of Steel, and then it's all Snyderverse from there.
Yeah.
But that's for a later date. Thank you all for listening to this season of DC Multicast. This has been a pleasure. I've had so much fun talking about all these DC movies, rewatching all these DC movies. Dominic, thank you for presenting on the final episode of the season. How can folks find you on the internet and everything that you got going on?
Oh, well, thank you, Keith. Yeah, great pleasure. I'm always happy to talk about Watchmen. I'm Dominic Mah. I'm not doing a bunch of social media these days because
I don't blame you.
Breaks the brain, but I do exist. If you want to contact me for like professional or chatty reasons, Dama, DOMMAH on most of the socials. And also I have an indie music group called 12 Valentines, which you can find on Bandcamp and YouTube Music and all the places, which is somewhat comic book related, but is also just about catchy pop songs to guide us through a tricky time in the world. And yourself, Keith?
Yes, I am on social media, but like Dominic, I do not try to use it so much because I like to stay sane and not lose my mind and slowly drift off into insanity like the pirate from the Black Freighter. But if you want to find me on the internet, you can find me at The Real Chow on multiple platforms, or follow the Nerds of Color at the Nerds of Color on every single social media platform you can think of. You can listen to the episodes of this podcast at hardknockmedia.com. That's NOC for Nerds of Color. And if you want, you can subscribe and download at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get podcasts. As I said, this has been the DC Multicast. It's been a fun season reminiscing about all these films. We'll be back at a later date to talk about the next 10 films in the DC catalog. But until then, stay tuned. Same pod time, same pod channel.
Jonah Hex has its moments. I'll just add.
You might be the
guest.
guest. You might be the guest on that one. 'Cause
Megan
I don't
Fox
know.
is in it.
I don't know who will talk about Jonah Hex. Josh Brolin, he likes himself some comic book movies.
Good cast.